Hello, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Josh, and here we talk about books, literature, and all things bookish. Well, today I'm going to be talking about my favorite books that I read in 2023. But this is not a one-way street, so I definitely want to see what kind of books you enjoyed last year, so leave in the comments down below what your favorites were. And also, how many books did you end up reading last year? Last year, my Goodreads reading challenge was 20 books, but I ended up reading 64. I did not anticipate that, but it happened, and I'm quite thrilled about that. This current year, 2024, I have created a reading challenge of 24 books, I believe, so that's 2 books per month. I just don't want to pressure myself. That's one thing that I want to do this year, or rather don't want to do, is put pressure on myself to read. I want to enjoy reading. Reading is a fun hobby for me. It is something that I absolutely love doing. I don't want it to feel like work. I don't want it to feel like an obligation, even if it's a personal obligation, unrelated to work. I want it to just be fun. And so I'm putting a low pressure reading challenge for myself this year. But it is still a challenge nonetheless, because it keeps me accountable, and that's something that I want in order to grow as a person, and also it encourages me to keep reading, because sometimes, life can happen, and it doesn't allow you to do the things that you love. And I always want to make sure that I have that work-life balance set in place, so that I'm always doing the things that I love. So, today we're going to be talking about my favorite books from 2023. And out of these 64, the first one that I'm going to be talking about is actually called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Now, this one I believe I gave 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, which is something that I don't often do. A book has to be really close to perfect, technically speaking, for myself. I thought it was beautifully written, technically speaking, and also artistically speaking. I felt like the way that it was written I felt like its tone was very consistent. It was immaculate in the way that it evoked emotion, the way in which it kept a person thinking in its choice of vocabulary, which I thought was really cool because a lot of the words were actually French loan words, and as someone who speaks the French language, I absolutely adored that aspect of it. I thought it was a really cool element of an English language novel. And I actually learned a lot of words, which actually I knew in French already, but I didn't know that they were also used in English. So that was cool. When you learn another language, you often learn more about your native language. And that's kind of the case in this scenario. Even though this book is written in English, I still kind of learned through French, so that was pretty neat. I also really loved the way in which different literary devices were employed in this particular book. The way it created a foreshadow to what was going to come that was solidifying the verisimilitude of the twist at the end without providing spoilers. I thought that was very expertly done. I also really appreciated the fact that there was that twist, because I was not anticipating things to tonally shift in that regard. I knew something was going to happen. I knew it was going to be a little bit darker, but I did not realize that it was going to take the route that it ended up taking. But I was very much pleased, though it was heart-wrenching. I'm pretty sure I cried, and it was hard to read at some points because it was just so emotive, so tense. You know that expression when you walk into a room and you can cut the air with a knife? I felt like that's what was happening in the story of this book. Like, I felt like you could cut the words with a knife. Like, I felt like the tension that had been created in this environment from the words on the page were just so incredibly dense that it was like something that you could actually cut through with a sharp object. Like, it was absolutely wild. I had never experienced that in literature before, and I was so intrigued by the fact that I was going through that kind of experience with a book. There is definitely power in literature, and this book clearly demonstrated that in so many different ways. Another way in which it demonstrated that is how it approached the topic of relationships, and not just any type of relationship, but friendship. A lot of books talk about friendship, but they usually talk about it on a more superficial level, and I felt like this book actually talks about it on a deeper level, on a level that includes nuance and layers. There are so many different layers, so many different dimensions of relationships in real life, and I felt like this really dove into the dynamics of friendship. It really explored the expectations for romance and then squashed all of those, because not all friendships end up in romance. You can have a 100% platonic relationship between two people of the opposite sex. And you know how that old saying goes, a man can never be friends with a woman, but that's not the case in reality. And I really liked how this book went into that stereotype, and it explored it and it exploited it. And it talked about how friendship can be just as intimate as romance, but, you know, in a different way. How it is just as much needed, just as much sought after, just as much necessary as any other type of relationship. We are all human, and we all need connection. We all need communication. We need closeness. We need understanding and communication. And I loved how it talked about that. The way in which it brought up feminism as well, and how it inserted that theme into the relationship and how it affected it. I just thought that was a really cool view into the female condition in the video game industry, and how that can actually relate to many industries around the world that are male-dominated. And I also really appreciated its use of perspectivism in general, how it showed that nothing is clear-cut. Doesn't matter if it is in work, if it is in one's personal life, nothing is clear-cut. Nothing is black and white. Things have layers. Things have shades. This is why I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. It was incredible. It was unforgettable. And it was honestly a book. It is honestly a book that I still think about today. And it's been approximately a year later, because I started reading this at the beginning of last year. I'm glad I read it. I'm definitely glad I read it. And there's also a reason why it won Best Fiction of 2022 as well. So if you're interested, check out that book. It's just one of my favorites. My next favorite here, if we look through my list of books that I've read, let's see here, The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. I thought this book was brilliant. Honestly, I had heard so much about this book online from watching BookTube, from, watching different reels on Instagram. I had heard a lot about it from my wife as well. She really enjoyed the book. But I don't know. I just thought it's a romance. How can a romance be great, But I am a sucker for romantic comedies. I've always enjoyed that genre in film, and I had never really explored that genre too much in writing. This year, however, I have fully explored it. I feel like I read so many rom-coms, so many romances in general, and The Love Hypothesis was honestly fantastic. The reason why I thought it was fantastic is because it did not really use tropes as its primary source of foundation or development. Yes, it has tropes. Yes, it employs those tropes to a certain degree, as every single romance novel or every single novel in general does. But this one in particular does not use it to the point where it is cliche, in my opinion. Instead, what it does is it gives strength and power to the female character. She's the protagonist, and it encourages STEM exploration among women. It also talks about, the sexist elements of the STEM fields. And I know that this is just a rom-com, but it still had these elements in it that made it more profound, and that's one of the reasons why I really appreciated that. But if we do speak more on the romantic comedy side of things, I did really appreciate the banter. The dialogue I thought was so incredibly natural, and the narration within the dialogue I thought was also fun and creative. I did not really appreciate the fact that she often talked about how tall he was or how big his hands were. I thought that was cliche. That is true. I'm not a fan of having gratuitous sex scenes or gratuitous object of desire scenes. I think it's important to show something that is realistic, of course, but I don't really like that fantastical element when it is not a part of the psychological development of characterization. And I just felt like it was simply fan service. And that's why I did not like that part. So I did not give this particular book 5 out of 5 stars. I believe I gave it 4 or 4.5 out of 5. Regardless, that's a high score from me, and I also just really loved it, and I'm excited to read Love on the Brain, which I have not done yet. I was supposed to do it as a buddy read with a friend, and I dropped the ball because she read it, and she said, "Oh, what'd you think of the book?" And I thought, why we were supposed to read that book? I thought we were supposed to inform each other that it was actually going to happen. And apparently I did, and I forgot that I did. So I still have to read it so that we can actually talk about it, her and I. So I hope to be doing that sometime soon this year. Moving on to my next favorite book, I would have to say, this year I guess must have been quite the year of feminism, because my third favorite book is called American Mermaid, which has a lot of themes of feminism and sexism within it. This particular book is about, how do I describe it? It's interesting. It's a literary fiction fantasy, but I feel like it's quite speculative as well. It's written by a comedian, and I believe this is her first fiction novel, which I think is so impressive. I feel like the way in which it was written is on the same level as Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, in that it was so intelligently written. It was so clever. The vocabulary was well elevated. It had a consistent tone. The threading of storyline, or the threading within the storyline, was fantastic. It was expertly crafted. The literary devices that were used were beautiful. It made it poetic. It made it well organized. It made it logical. It was great. The story itself is very interesting too. It's about this girl who, spoiler alert, just so you know, I am going to, potentially say some spoilers. I don't really remember when these took place in the book, but I don't believe it's on the blurb, so I'm just going to say this now. This is a spoiler alert, so unless you want to ruin the storyline for yourself, do not listen further. You can skip ahead. For this particular book, American Mermaid, it is basically about this mermaid who does not know that she's a mermaid. She was kidnapped, so to speak. It's a little bit unclear what exactly happened, but I believe she was kidnapped, if I'm remembering correctly. She's kidnapped, and she is adopted by this family, and this doctor was in charge of performing surgery on this particular mermaid, and this surgery was to remove her tail. And he did this by dividing her tail in half to give her legs, but in doing so it paralyzed her and put her in a wheelchair. And the main character, who is this former mermaid, or current mermaid with no tail, she does not know this. And so her whole life she believes that she has been bound to this chair as a human being, and her life is very limited. There are not a lot of resources out there for her, unfortunately, in this world. And so she becomes very depressed, and she ends up going to a lake to basically roll in and to not come out again. But that is when she discovers that she can certainly come out again, because she does not need to breathe underwater, as she is a mermaid. And she experiences this freedom that she never had on land before. And she is so perplexed by this. She does not understand. And what's interesting about this is this thing that is happening in the story is actually the screenplay of the main character, the real main character, who is this woman who is trying to adapt her book, her best-selling book, into a movie. And the other writers of this movie are all men. and they're not allowing her to do things that she wants to do. They are constantly trying to sexualize this character, and she's wanting to be more practical about things, saying, she's part fish, she does not have the type of organs that you think she has, and they're wanting to do all these different things to Hollywoodify this particular story, and she's fighting against it. And this is where the themes of feminism really come in and present themselves. And what's interesting is the more that she allows these things that the men are telling her to do to actually happen in real life, the more her story starts to become real life, and it starts to affect her and her project and her work and her personal life. And it's just really interestingly interconnected. I'm going to be honest, the ending, unfortunately, I just didn't fully understand, and that's okay. And I had to look up the explanation on YouTube. And sometimes you got to do that. But to me, that's what really shows a profound story. I obviously missed some things, and that's kind of a good thing, because that means I'm going to have to read it again. And that means I get to enjoy it again, and I get to learn more about it, and I get to dissect it further the second time that I read it, and to me, that's so fun. So I'm quite excited about that in the future. This book gave me a book hangover. 100% it gave me a book hangover. It was wild. I did not read another book for quite some time afterward, because I was just, still within its trance. It was a fun experience, I will say that. And surprisingly, it was a fast read for myself, even though I do think it is a heavier one and would not typically be one. The next book that I want to mention here, oh my gosh, I definitely want to mention Paris, the memoir by Paris Hilton. This, as the name states, is a memoir. It's nonfiction. I was familiar with Paris Hilton because I grew up with her rise of fame in the media. I was too young to fully understand it. All I knew is that she was related to some family that owned hotels, and that she was a model. That's pretty much all I knew. Didn't pay any attention to her other than watching The Simple Life when I was a child, and I thought it was hilarious. So that's all I really knew about Paris Hilton. I saw that she had a memoir, though, and I saw that with the conversation of Britney Spears and her memoir coming out, that, she was influenced, or rather inspired, by Britney Spears to come out with her own story. And then I started seeing these interviews, one in particular with Drew Barrymore, which I thought was very, very interesting and eye-opening, about her experiences in this cult. And I was just shocked, absolutely shook. I could not believe that type of evil could exist. And so I started to watch more interviews from her, and I started to think, how can a person, who has experienced this come out on top, seemingly with no scars? And clearly she does have very deep emotional ones, which I have learned from reading her book, but the way that she wrote her story, I just thought was beautifully vulnerable. It was shocking, but it was just so matter of fact. She weaved her personality within the words as well in the pages. When she talked about the fact that she suffers from ADHD, and she talked about how that is going to affect the organization of her writing, and that she was okay with that because she wanted it to be more organic in its delivery. And I thought that was so cool, using her neurodivergence to elevate her story and to bring further truth to the story that so desperately needs to see the light of day. I don't want to give any spoilers, but I definitely encourage you to pick up her book and read it. It is so fascinating. Her story on a superficial level is interesting, but on a deeper level, many layers down, is so unbelievable. I cried. I sat there, thought-provoked, contemplating about life, contemplating about what I, experienced. while she was rising to fame. It's like I was confronted, I faced the confrontation of my own accidental judgment of others and of her, and I learned about myself, I learned about the world, I learned about her, I learned about, the psychology and the power of human beings and the power that God has given us to withstand and endure and to overcome the most horrendous circumstances, and to share our story so that others do not fall victim to those circumstances in the future. And for that very reason, I think it is a beautiful book and one that desperately needs to be read. It is so incredibly important. So, like I said, I definitely encourage you to read it. I was not expecting to have that kind of reaction to that particular book, or for it to even be that good, but it certainly was. So it is one of my top favorite books of 2023. And lastly, the fifth book that I want to mention is called Luli, and the Language of Tea by Andrea Wang. This book, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. It's so simple, but it's so beautiful. It talks about these children who are all very young. They're probably like 5, 6 years old, somewhere around there. And they are all the descendants of these immigrants who have come to Canada or the United States. They've come to a country where they have to learn English. And so none of these children have a shared language, but they're all in the ESL daycare. This one girl, I believe she's from China, and she decides to bring everyone together to play and to have fun. And in order to bring everyone together, she decides to bring tea. And the word for tea is very similar in a lot of different languages. So she ends up bringing all these teacups and this little tea, and she starts serving it to all of her little classmates. I don't know how realistic that is for children that young to be drinking tea in other cultures. I know in my own culture it's not common, but who knows? I just thought it was a beautiful sentiment and a great image, and it had this linguistic aspect, which as a language learner and a language educator, I absolutely love. So I thought it was beautiful. I cried. It also has lots of different languages present, like Turkish, Russian, Portuguese, Spanish, French, like so many different languages. Persian, I believe, is also represented. I don't think French is, but Persian is. It's so cool, and I definitely encourage you to read that one, even if you are an adult. Check it out. It's a beautiful story. There's not a lot of fiction that is really wide out in the open regarding immigration and the immigration condition or experience. And so I think this one is a great one to share with children, especially if you are an immigrant and you have a child who is struggling to adapt or integrate into their new surroundings or to make friends. So those are my favorite books this past year. Let me know in the comments below if you've heard of these books, if you're interested in reading them. Let me know how many books you have read and which are your favorites that you've read this year. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, bye for now.